Nature abhors a vacuum, and the collapse of Austria-Hungary caused such a vacuum. The remaining Habsburgs now found themselves in a dangerous position as vultures began circling around Austria's corpse. Ludwig Victor, the Duke of Bukovina, suddenly found himself to be juicy prey for King Carol I of Romania, while Karl Ludwig, the Grand Duke of Galicia, petitioned his brother King Maximilian of Bohemia for German protection against Russia. As for Elizabeth Marie, the Archduchess of Dalmatia and the only daughter of Rudolf, she was swiftly whisked away to Prague once it became clear that Dalmatia was no longer safe. Two separate kingdoms had their eyes on Dalmatia: the Kingdom of Italy, that had unified and quickly risen to become one of the great powers of Europe, and the Kingdom of Serbia, which had gained independence and substantial swaths of land with the support of the Russian Empire. However, as both kingdoms began expanding towards one another, it became clear that both these kingdoms would soon come into conflict, as both laid historic claims to the rich port of Trieste. At the time of the Austrian commune, however, Italy was busy in the midst of a war with Greece to claim the Ionian Islands, bringing it into conflict with both Britain and Germany. At first, it seemed like your typical underdog story, with the weaker Italy able to take the upper hand against the larger empires by locking Greek armies under blockade on the island of Corfu, while her armies pillaged her way across Greece proper. Britain and Germany were slow to react, although it still remained uncertain whether Italy could in fact pull off this feat. Similarly, Serbia also was in an underdog position by laying claim to Croatia and Slovenia, bringing it into conflict with the much stronger Hungary and the newly created Austrian commune at a time when the more conservative Russia was looking to turn away from war. In both cases, both rising kingdoms were able to challenge the hegemony of their more powerful neighbors. However, it was a delicate dance in which one would ultimately slip. Italy, having become overconfident in its military capabilities, believed that an unexpected southern push into Germany itself, a reverse Hannibal maneuver that could catch the German military off guard, at a time when the German military was currently loading its available troops onto ships in the north of the country. Such a maneuver could guarantee a swift end to the war they were already winning. De Leon, the chairman of the Austrian commune, had been carefully balancing his difficult position between Germany and Italy to both preserve the workers' revolution and avoid getting drawn into the larger European conflict. However, with Serbian troops making their way to Vienna and the Italian military on his doorstep, De Leon caved in to Italian demands, and eager Italian forces began pouring over the Alps into Bavaria. The affair was a disaster for Italy. As quick as blitzkrieg lightning, the German army came down from the north and utterly crushed the Italian forces, while Canadian troops landed in Sardinia and Sicily. Italy was soon after forced to the peace table after her humiliating defeat. Serbia, by contrast, was able to push her way all the way to Slovenia and establish herself as the United Kingdom of Southern Slavs, or Yugoslavia, in 1889. While Italy would continue to decline into the 19th century, with a failed invasion of Libya at the hands of Japan, Yugoslavia would rise, taking more and more land around the Dalmatian coast. Yugoslavia had proved she could win wars without Russia's help, but whether she could win a war against another great power remained to be seen. Daniel de Leon was in an unenviable position. He had won his revolution, but at what cost? The unlikely alliance of nationalists and socialists had led to one of only two successful communist revolutions in the history of the world, the other being the Banana Republic of Nicaragua. He had hoped that the workers' victory in Vienna would spark a chain reaction across the rest of the former Austrian Empire, and perhaps even Europe itself, to break the chains of monarchy, aristocracy, religion, conservatism, and capitalism. Instead, most Eastern European nationalists found success by cooperating with the great powers rather than fighting them. Bosnians and Serbs gained their freedom from the Ottomans. Hungarians had already broken free from Austria, and Romania and the new Yugoslavia had succeeded in freeing their people through their own efforts. The nationalist revolts that had not succeeded in Ukraine, Poland, and elsewhere were predominantly religious and predominantly conservative, and would never make any alliance with socialist or communist elements. De Leon's revolution quickly shifted from being one of expansion to one of survival. The commune's two neighbors, Germany and Italy, both greedily eyed Austrian land, so De Leon had to strike a balance between appeasing these two neighbors who were currently at war over Greece. Believing that Germany might be the bigger threat of the two, De Leon attempted to be more friendly towards Italy, allowing them military access and providing vague promises about the Sud Tyrol region, much to the chagrin of the German nationalists who had helped De Leon's revolution to succeed in the first place. When Italy lost the war, however, De Leon soon found himself face to face with a very angry, very bitter Germany. De Leon realized his position was in danger, but he had one ace up his sleeve. He had connections with the underground Communist Party in Germany, led by August Bebel. They had been skeptical, even hostile, to De Leon's revolution of National Socialism, but many still remained sympathetic and saw it as a necessary evil in order to bring about the workers' revolution. The victory in Greece was still quite unpopular in Germany, especially after the Italian invasion from the south. With the commune under threat and popular unrest at an all-time high, Bebel called for a May Day uprising, utilizing guns and weapons supplied from the Austrian commune. Although the uprising was not as strong in the south and west of Germany, many dissatisfied farmers and laborers across Pomerania, and even Berlin itself, took up arms against Friedrich III. De Leon made provocative speeches in Vienna, condemning the imperial interests of the German Kaiserreich, and calling for all workers across Germany to take up arms. His words were wasted, as the revolts were put down after only a month. Surely, this was the last straw. Many feared that Germany would soon declare war on De Leon for his actions, but war never came. Instead, many of the Austrian nationalists, who had originally supported De Leon, now challenged his authority. The Austrian nationalists soon became German pan-nationalists, as they predominantly lived along the border of Germany and the Germanified Sudetenland in Bohemia. These farmers and laborers took up pitchforks after many of their lands had been destroyed during the Yugoslav invasions of a few years prior. Realizing it was all over, De Leon fled Vienna and successfully escaped to his native Netherlands, where he would continue to live for several years, before spending the rest of his days in Paris with the growing totalist movement in France. These pan-nationalists allowed free, multi-party elections, opened its borders with Germany, and removed the restrictions on property ownership, the free press, and freedom of speech and association. It was only a few months after this new revolution that the pan-nationalist regime hosted a plebiscite to petition Friedrich III for annexation into the Greater German Empire, to be under the direct ownership of Prussia. There was some hesitation on Friedrich's part, as it seemed likely that the annexation would be opposed by both Britain and Russia. Nonetheless, At the behest of the eager pan-German movement within Germany itself, Friedrich accepted the Pan-Nationalist Declaration, and on the 15th of April, 1893, Austria was at last brought back into the fold of a united Germany. In truth, De Leon's proletarian dictatorship was relatively mild compared with the violent extremism of other political revolutions. Although the Austrian commune was a one-party state, with the commune restricting the right to property and the freedom of the press, there were none of the violent executions of political opponents, or the destruction of religion and culture, as seen in the French Revolution. Yet it may have been this light-handed despotism that would endanger the workers' movement. Whereas the First Internationale had been a united socialist front for the workers' cause, the Second Internationale of the 1890s saw deep divisions within its ranks over the failure of De Leon's experiment. Socialists and communists saw the Austrian Commune as a failure because it depended too heavily on nationalist rhetoric to advance its goals, and thus compromised the workers' cause. Moderate socialists like Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein proposed a more orthodox, conciliatory socialism that would eventually evolve into what we call democratic socialism going into the 20th century. More radical socialists of a nationalist slant, like Georges Sorel and Charles Maurras, argued that an appeal to tribal instincts and national myth were necessary elements in truly starting a workers' revolution, in order to prevent the revolution from undermining its own foundations by alienating the communist vanguard from the workers they were liberating. Rather than destroy cultural, religious, and national identity, such aspects of society should be harnessed and steered towards triggering a grassroots syndicalism, rather than a coup d'etat revolution by intellectual elites. A total restructuring of society from the bottom up, rather than top down. For these totalists, the failure of De Leon's commune was that he had been too weak and too lenient in letting foreign agents infiltrate and hijack his revolution. Had De Leon not become so detached from his followers, and if he had utilized religion, culture, and state press to make his appeals, he could have prevented the pan-nationalists from rising behind his back. Whatever discussion and debate took place behind closed doors, the great powers of Europe could take a deep sigh of relief, knowing that the Red Menace that had toppled one of the oldest empires of Europe was put to rest. Nonetheless, if more bloody wars were to erupt, and if more nationalist unrest were to spread, perhaps De Leon's unholy union of National Socialism may yet again rise from the ashes. Bismarck had grown slower and more tired towards the end of the 1880s. He suffered a fatal stroke at the age of 73 in 1888 and would depart from politics soon after, becoming bedridden by 1890. It came as a shock to the world when he unexpectedly, silently passed away on the night of August 10th, 1892. The Iron Chancellor who created Germany and remade the European balance of power was dead. After an ornate, pompous ceremony bedecked his funeral, many in Germany and Europe wondered whether Germany and her new Kaiser could survive without his guiding hand. Friedrich III had so far proven himself to be a competent emperor, maintaining cordial relations with both Russia and Britain, even achieving a short-lived alliance with the latter. To liberals, he was a champion of political rights and reform, overturning the old Prussian pseudo-constitutionalism in favor of a true constitutional monarchy. To conservatives, he was a protector of the established order in Europe, defending Greece from the imperial advances of Italy. Friedrich had managed to endear himself to almost all of Europe. Nonetheless, he had one fatal flaw. As a boy raised learning the history of the German people, there was a pan-German political streak in his blood that he had never fully purged. It was one of the few policies that both he and Bismarck were in total agreement. Both shared a secret desire to one day reunite Austria with Germany, but they both knew perfectly well that the outcry and outrage of Europe would be too much. However, the recent revolutions in Austria proved to be too great a temptation for Friedrich. The dream of uniting the old Holy Roman Empire into a new German one still ached his soul. It didn't help matters that he had surrounded himself with war-hawkish ministers and pan-nationalist confidants who had even grander schemes of not only bringing in Austria, but even Bohemia, Croatia, and other former Austrian possessions into the empire. For a long time, Friedrich was prudent enough to keep such talk at arm's length, but when Austria practically offered herself to Germany, in spite of the threats of war from Russia and Britain, Friedrich caved in. Several months had passed. Britain and Russia had no immediate response to Germany's blatant defiance, and many in Germany concluded that Britain and Russia had been making empty threats. After all, Britain and Germany had been allies in defending Greece only 3 years earlier, and Russia's pan-Slavic agenda was in no way threatened by Germany annexing other Germans. Besides, the Austrian commune, with its radical political agenda, was a greater threat to European peace. Perhaps Friedrich could be more aggressive in pursuing annexation for Bohemia and Croatia. Nonetheless, Friedrich quieted such talk and was content for there to be peace in his time. It was a great shock then when returning Prime Minister William Gladstone declared war on Germany in conjunction with Alexander III of Russia on September 10th. A recent parliamentary election had ousted the Tories led by Lord Salisbury and had also upset previous foreign policy, as Britain once again renewed her alliance with Russia to contain German power. Once again, the guns sounded across the fields and cities of Poland as German forces quickly mobilized against the Russian defenses. Despite some early successes, the infamous Russian winter had begun to swoop down into Poland, halting the German advance. For the unsuspecting Friedrich, the war was quickly turning into a nightmare. Not only was the German advance in Poland checked, but the British Royal Navy was threatening invasion along the North Sea coast, and the French Republic had declared her intentions to reclaim Alsace-Lotharingen. Threatened by the possibility of a two-front war, Friedrich decided to cool tensions by agreeing to come to the bargaining table in March of 1894. The humiliating Treaty of Brussels dictated severe war reparations to Britain and Russia, a reduction cap on German armed forces, and that the throne of Austria must pass to Elizabeth Marie, Rudolph's daughter, while still remaining in the German Empire. The shameful defeat in a war that Germany had been winning had shattered the spirits of many, and seriously called Friedrich's ability to rule into question. For Friedrich, he knew that if he seriously intended to pursue his ambitions of reclaiming the old Austrian Empire, he had better prepare Germany for a two-front war, since both Britain and Russia, and possibly France, would thwart any attempt to move forward. China was in the midst of what would later be called a century of humiliation. Although she still appeared strong to the outside world, and in truth her military strength was formidable, the technological advances of the Western powers, the rabid corruption of the Qing court, and the inability to keep the country united had seen her lose crucial Pacific ports little by little. First, The British had claimed some of her treaty ports in the south. The Japanese invaded neighboring Korea, and more recently, the French made their way to the Heavenly Throne's doorstep in Indochina. When the Emperor Guangxu challenged French control of the region, the war was a long, protracted embarrassment for both nations, as both armies, wary of the numerical strength and technological advance of the other, hesitated to engage each other in direct battle. As the war began taking its toll on the Chinese after 10 years of jungle fighting, they began employing more questionable strategies to bring the war to a quick conclusion. A foolhardy admiral named Yuan Sen launched a full-scale naval invasion of Madagascar in an attempt to distract the French and divert their attention away from Indochina. He missed his destination, but was still able to lay siege to the neighboring Mayotte, which only served to further embarrass the Carnot and later the Perrier government in Paris. It was only after a difficult battle in the city of Hanoi that French forces were finally able to secure their victory. France was unable to take the border province along China's borders, but was able to force Guangzhou to surrender the port of Quangchawan, near Hainan, to guarantee French trade with the Jade Empire. This mixed defeat did nothing to help Guangzhou's increasing unpopularity at home, as more and more Western powers were forcing more and more concessions from China. Anti-Western groups, such as the Boxers, began stirring unrest, threatening Western merchants and missionaries and vandalizing Western embassies and consulates. These isolated acts soon became more frequent and more coordinated as the Qing government fluctuated from being unable to stop the attacks to actively encouraging them. This obvious political endorsement finally attracted the ire of the Western powers in 1896, when the Qing army joined Boxer protesters in attacking the German-occupied port of Qingdao. Now, not only was China at war with Germany, but also the Netherlands, France, Britain, and most importantly, Russia. War came along the Mongol-Manchurian border, where 250,000 Russians poured over the Chinese border to reclaim Port Arthur. As Russian forces drew near to the capital, Chinese military generals and governors forced Guangzhou to concede defeat before the whole of China be carved up by the Western powers. Guangzhou was forced to respect the Western ports and allow complete, safe access to Western travelers within the country, and to hand over the city of Tientsin to a joint commission of other nations to ensure these demands were met. The so-called Tientsin concessions were a joint committee of British, Russian, German, French, Dutch, American, and Japanese ambassadors, and enjoyed the protection of the neighboring Russian garrison at Port Arthur. Qing authority is at an all-time low, with many concluding Guangzhou has lost heaven's mandate. Now, many generals and governors begin scheming to advance their own ambitions and power. Many political radicals and anarchists are plotting the empire's demise. China hangs on by a thread, with civil war on the horizon. The collapse of the Qing dynasty is not a question of if, but when. Although Germany was still reeling from her defeat in the German Containment War, Friedrich was eager to claim another victory. His popularity had suffered after the war, and the 1892 Pomeranian Uprising, sponsored by the Austrian commune, told him how tenuous his grip on power was after Bismarck's death. If he could win another war and claim more land for Germany, he might be able to reclaim his lost pride and Germany's lost honor. He considered putting pressure on King Maximilian of Bohemia into joining the German Empire as a junior member, but hesitated, since any attempt to do so would garner the attention of Britain, who had previously guaranteed Bohemian independence. An easier target was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to the south. Russia had dissolved her alliance with Yugoslavia, which had claimed the Archduchy of Dalmatia from Elizabeth Marie, the new Archduchess of Austria. Not only did Elizabeth have a territorial claim on the region, but there were also various pro-Austrian movements in Slovenia and Croatia. Groups such as the Ustaša resented Serbian domination and would likely welcome the return of a Habsburg to the throne of Dalmatia. So it happened on August 28, 1898, while Britain was focusing on fighting a Boer uprising in South Africa, and Alexander III was putting down a National Socialist uprising in Ukraine, that Friedrich declared war on King Alexander I of Yugoslavia to claim Slovenia. What would have been an easy war to crush the much weaker Yugoslav army suddenly proved difficult when France, the other great power, declared war to reclaim her lost provinces. The German army, that was supposed to link up with Bohemian forces in Vienna, had to swiftly turn to the Rhine and prepare for an unexpected French attack. Soon, it was Yugoslav troops that were crossing the German border instead of the other way around. They were quickly beaten back by the Bohemians and Hungarians, but the situation became dire on the Western Front, where 500,000 Frenchmen made their way into the Ruhr Valley. Friedrich, rather than push for the entirety of Slovenia and Croatia, as he would have liked, compromised with King Alexander in exchange for Slovenia, so that he could focus the entire German might on France. Once the ink was dry, Bohemian and Hungarian armies quickly made their way to the Western Front for a brutal counterattack. This second war against France proved to be more difficult than the first. While in the Franco-Spanish War, Germany, Italy, and Spain were attacking France on three sides, Germany and her allies could only apply pressure on a single front. The result was a much bloodier and much longer war, as German, Bohemian, and Hungarian forces struggled to find an opening in the French onslaught to push their way to Paris. Eventually, the sheer force of the German artillery was too much, as French forces had been pushed further and further south, giving German forces an opening to claim Paris. Yet again, just like in the Franco-Spanish War, the French determination to fight was stronger than Germany had given her credit. Not even with the collapse of her armed forces and the Black Eagle flying over Paris did France give up. As spring gave way to summer in 1899, it was not until virtually every square mile of French land was occupied did the Perrier government, residing in exile on the island of Corsica, agree to concede defeat. Friedrich III was a little bitter that his attempt to reclaim Dalmatia had been thwarted. However, he was still able to prove to the world that Germany, even under the harsh restrictions of the Treaty of Brussels, was able to hold her own even without great power allies. It was a message that had made its way to Madrid, where Spain had once again risen to great power status and renewed her alliance with Germany. Now with allies on her side to check the power of Russia and France, Germany could once again look to take her place as continental power.